As the Iran conflict continues through its fifth month, pressure is mounting on both sides of the aisle to end this conflict. New Jersey's governor, Mikie Sherrill, announces that nearly 6,600 non citizens were found on their voter rolls, with around 400 voting. What does this actually mean, and why is this so important? And finally, why the decision today made in the Shiloh Hendrix case is actually a fairly conservative position if equally applied. My name is Ben Corriveau, and welcome to my show. Okay, to start off with, we had more news in the Iran conflict. It just started getting hotter again because it's obviously been somewhat hot, somewhat cold. After the MOU was signed, it was mostly done for probably about 2 to 3 weeks, and then fighting started breaking out again. And this weekend, we had 4 American soldiers killed in Iran. I have all 4 of them up right now. This is Private First Class Isabella Gonzalez, First Lieutenant Tyler Fian, Sergeant Angel S. Rampersad, and Sergeant Michael Emmanuel Swinton. So please keep them in your prayers, them and their families, because they really did serve us. And it's unfortunate they died, especially in this conflict, which seems to be problematic. And I'll be the first to tell you that I was wrong because I did say that I was going to give them some time to figure it out. And it seems like they clearly haven't met that timeline that I provided. Again, I don't know any inside information, so maybe they have different intel that I don't have. But based on all the information I have, I was wrong in trusting them in this one instance. But the track record was there, so I did have at least some sort of reasoning to believe that this could potentially work out. Now, obviously, with this, there was a ton of pressure to pull us out of Iran. And this resulted in the House once again passing another resolution seeking to end our involvement in this conflict, particularly by invoking the War Powers Act, because that's Congress is the only political body in the federal government that actually has the power to declare war on another nation. And the War Powers Act gives the president some leeway with that by giving them, I believe it's a 60-day period to manage conflict. But if it's over that period, then they need to seek congressional approval. This was to force congressional approval. And it's definitely, in my mind, something that should be done just because of the way that the Constitution is written. Now, there are arguments to be made why this is extremely bad timing for this, because we're kind of in the middle of it. We've been going through negotiations, and I do believe that this could put a damper on Trump's negotiation power, because if Congress says that he can't continue to engage in these military operations, then it could mean that he can't use force and therefore may lose some of his power in leverage in these negotiations. So on that side, it's bad. But speaking of the constitutionality of it, Congress is the only political body that has the power to actually levy war against or declare war against other nations or entities. And also looking at historical precedent, the War Powers Act seems to be very, very lenient in the time period, with several relatively recent presidents actually going beyond that 60-day limit, with Congress not necessarily actually giving them confirmation prior to that conflict wrapping up. So it's a mixed bag, but like I said, I would like to see this conflict ended, but I would prefer it if it ends in a way that benefits the U.S. to the best extent that is possible. Now, Congress this week also, the House passed a bill to limit stock purchases by members of Congress, and this is focusing strictly on individual stocks. We have this from CBS News. Lawmakers approved the bill in a 232 to 198 vote, with 13 Democrats voting with all Republicans in favor. The Stop Insider Trading Act was introduced by Representative Brian Steele of Wisconsin in January and would prohibit members of Congress, their spouses, and dependent children from purchasing publicly traded stocks. It would also require lawmakers to publicly disclose each intended sale of stocks at least 7 days in advance to the House clerk or Senate secretary. The penalty for a violation is $2,000 or 10% of the transaction's value, whichever is greater, as well as the forfeiture of any realized gains from the sale. Just continuing on, Republicans combined the stock trading bill with an unrelated provision that requires voters to show photo identification when voting in federal elections as President Trump pushes for strict new voter eligibility rules. Democrats panned the bill as not going far enough, pushing for an outright ban on members of Congress from owning stocks and for those limits to also extend to the president and administration officials. So a bit much there. I did want to pull a big snippet for this just because I felt like a lot of this context was actually necessary, both describing what the bill was, the arguments for, against, as well as what happened with this bill, adding a little bit of bloat to it. Obviously, this includes part of the Save America Act, which is the photo ID in order to actually register to vote, which I'm in favor of. I don't like typically when they add stuff that's not related to the entire bill in there. Luckily, this passed, so that wasn't an issue. At least it passed the House. It needs to pass the Senate now, but if it were to go into law, which I highly doubt it will. But that being said, it did pass the House. And again, this is kind of a mixed bag. I do believe that it's good that we're stopping congressional members from actually trading individual stocks, because the problem with this is that they could make a decision short a stock because they know the decision that they're going to make, or they'll make a decision in order to financially benefit themselves, which kind of defeats the purpose of them actually representing the people, or in historically the Senate's case, the state itself. So that's a bit of a problem, and luckily this addresses that. However, at the same time, Democrats complaining that this doesn't go far enough, saying that we need to completely ban members from Congress from owning stocks during their terms. That I feel like is a bit of a stretch, because I don't feel like we should be financially hindering congressional members. We should just make sure that they aren't making decisions based on their finances as opposed to the will of the people. But their criticism of this not extending to the president and administration officials is actually quite fair in my mind, because same thing can happen there as it can with Congress. So I do believe we should have more universal laws in regards to that. But unfortunately, they're not on the books now, and this is all that this bill does. I highly doubt this is going to pass the Senate. I put something up about this because if we can't get the Save America Act passed, which has across the country about 80 to 85% support, 70% support amongst Democrats, and 90 to 95% support amongst Republicans, it's pretty overwhelming, and they won't pass that because they're afraid that in reality it will actually hurt some of them in their elections. I feel like the same thing's going to happen here, where I guess because of the Save America Act portion of this bill, they're going to shut it down because of that. However, I do believe that it's also because they don't want to lose out on any potential financial gains that they could reach from that. However, this is all speculation, so take it with a grain of salt. Now, talking about federal buildings, and this was actually something that I thought was interesting, was we had a domestic terrorist attack a federal building this past week. It was an Army veteran, and so you can see here I have CBS News pulled up first, and I just want to show you this because of the media framing of this. This was Army veteran arrested for setting off fireworks and igniting fire outside federal building in New York City, FBI says. Now, just from that headline, again, most people only read the headlines of these stories. It seems like he was setting off fireworks, and these fireworks ignited a fire, and it happened to be outside of a federal building in New York City. Now, that's not what happened, and we'll get to that in a little bit. I just want to go through this piece quick. So this little citation that I pulled says, he came with bad intentions, Barnacle said, looking to injure people and harm people. He described Arabica as an anti-ICE activist who had a small cart with him with the slogan, "ICE off our streets," written on it. He is an anti-American, anti-government extremist, Barnacle said. Police sources said Arabica has had a previous encounter with federal agents for acting as an emotionally disturbed person but was not arrested. The FBI New York Joint Terrorism Task Force is investigating the incident. Airsoft guns, commercial-grade fireworks found. The suspect was carrying 2 airsoft guns, according to Tish. CBS News law enforcement analyst Richard Esposito described the materials as things you might use in paintball-type events. Tish said he fired several pellets into the air before he doused parts of the building in flammable liquid. The DHS spokesperson said the man's bag also contained a manifesto. So, okay. It's pretty clear what happened here just by reading that this wasn't just him setting off fireworks. He literally dumped parts of the building with what seems to be gasoline. It was some sort of flammable liquid, and then setting it on fire. And so let's actually get into this. And I'm surprised because CBS is typically more moderate. In this case, they're fairly left-leaning for that story. And ABC tends to be left-leaning, but in this case, they're actually reporting the truth in this. So here's a clip from ABC just actually highlighting, and this is a video of the incident actually occurring.
The alarming scene at the federal building here in New York City. Authorities tonight accusing a former U.S. soldier of setting fire outside the federal building in Lower Manhattan. Dramatic video tonight showing the suspect pouring gasoline on the steps to the building and igniting it, creating a huge wall of flames at 26 Federal Plaza. ICE, the FBI, and other federal agencies, all with officers inside. The suspect, taken down moments later, wrestled to the ground there. The FBI tonight calling it an anti-government attack.
You can see there, I mean, it's pretty clear that this man actually just dumped a bunch of gasoline all over the place and what seemed to be some potentially explosive canisters, and then set the whole thing on fire. Obviously, he was intending to cause harm here, and he had anti-ICE sentiments. And it's like I said, every single one of these things would stop if Democrats and leftists would stop calling ICE Gestapo, calling for violence, celebrating violence, justifying instances where they're calling for violence or violence occurs. All this needs to stop. And I get a lot of criticism about how apparently I always blame left-wing individuals for stuff. And then stuff like this happens, and then apparently I'm still in the wrong because ICE is Gestapo, despite the fact that they're two completely different things, and ICE is enforcing our laws. I don't know how you can really square that, but it really goes to show that a lot of these people don't actually know what's going on. They go based off of emotion, and I hope that if they see the facts, they'll actually change their minds, but I tend to believe that less and less as I do more politics. Now, while that happened in New York City, over in New Jersey, we had some crazy news where Governor Mikie Sherrill announced that they found 6,600 non-citizens on the voter rolls. We have this from Politico. It says that thousands of non-citizens were registered to vote in New Jersey due to software error, governor says. The stunning announcement comes amid a push by Republican President Donald Trump's administration to crack down on non-citizen voting, which the president claims, frequently without factual basis, aids Democrats in elections. Early this month, the Department of Homeland Security alleged that New Jersey had more than 35,000 non-citizens on its voting rolls. Sherrill, a Democrat, said on Tuesday that the MVC error, which lasted from June 2023 until June 2024, predating her own tenure as governor by several years, arose during the application process for driver's licenses and ID cards. Around 6,600 individuals marked themselves as non-citizens when they applied, but were added to voter rolls anyway. The accidental voters were scattered across the state and registered under a variety of party labels, according to Sherrill, with the majority being unaffiliated voters. Speaking with reporters at a hastily scheduled press conference, Sherrill said there's no immediate proof that any of the roughly 400 non-citizens who cast ballots impacted the outcome of any individual election. We have no evidence at this time that any elections were swayed, she said in response to a question from reporters. The state has nearly 7 million registered voters, and statewide elections typically draw between 1.5 million and 4 million votes. Okay, so they're telling you that to dilute it. That last statement right there is just to dilute the fact that there were 400 non-citizens who cast ballots. Because, and I get that New Jersey is a city, so it tends to have more residents. But I can tell you right now, in my town, it was a 300-point difference between a Republican majority and a Democrat majority for town council. So, yes, this is important. This is 400 non-citizens that voted in their elections. And it's also interesting, too, because these are individuals who marked themselves as non-citizens and were registered to vote. So that doesn't include any people who were non-citizens and did not claim that they were on their DMV documents. So there is potential for more fraud here. But let's dive a little bit deeper into this. So the governor is saying that it's a software error, which in my mind is quite surprising. It's not impossible, but surprising because typically with software, you want to actually narrow it down so it only has a narrow scope. And it turns out that that might actually have been the case because right here we have from Pix11, this is a New York local station. What is IDEMIA? Company linked to New Jersey voter registration error. IDEMIA was identified as a vendor involved in a 2023 software error that caused over 6,000 non-citizens to be registered to vote, just under 400 of whom actually voted. Governor Mikie Sherrill said in New Jersey, eligible residents are automatically enrolled to vote when they renew their driver's licenses or IDs. State officials said that MIA has been removed from the project and replaced with a new company. In a statement to Pix 11 News, a spokesperson for IDEMIA said the responsibility belongs to the state. IDEMIA's role to transmit information through the motor vehicle system. The voter registration information is transmitted to the New Jersey Department of State Division of Elections, which is ultimately responsible for verifying eligibility to vote, the spokesperson said. Information submitted by IDEMIA must still be validated and adjudicated by the Division of Elections. Now, it's pretty clear that that's the case. And New Jersey is trying to pin all the blame on them. Now, potentially they do have some blame if this was, in fact, a software error. However, like they're saying here, they're not responsible for who's on the voter rolls. The New Jersey government is responsible for who's on the voter rolls. So it's just funny that this is actually happening and they're trying to blame everybody. And if you actually remember, everybody, since 2020, this has been a talking point of the Democrats that there's no non-citizens voting in our elections. In fact, this is actually one of the big critiques of the Save America Act, that we don't need it because it's already illegal and non-citizens aren't voting in our election. Well, this disproves it. But just in case you don't believe me that this is one of their big talking points, I have this clip from Dan Bongino. I was going to pull it from townhall.com. Couldn't find the clip myself, so I did clip it from Dan Bongino's show. So thank you very much to him for actually putting this up. And I'll play the clip now.
Hat tip town hall. Here, you saw Donald Trump did that, President Trump, the speech on Thursday exposing a massive infiltration, agitprop operation in the United States by China and others. You saw in New Jersey, huge, enormous failures in the voter system we've been warning about forever. The Democrats aren't going to be able to hide this anymore. Here's Town Hall, hat tip to them, put together a video of Democrats swearing to you. The New Jersey illegals, 6,000 plus that were registered to vote illegally. You know what? That stuff doesn't happen. Really? They can't run away from this anymore. Check this out.
There is no evidence that undocumented migrants vote.
We're debating a problem that does not exist.
This is a solution in search of a problem that does not exist.
The evidence is almost no illegal immigrants vote. Some benign effort to tell the small number of illegal immigrants.
The reports show voter fraud is exceedingly rare, but there's a couple things we know about the administration.
Citizen voting in federal elections is already illegal.
There is no evidence of fraud or
corruption because we don't have a problem with illegal aliens voting in the country.
It's not an issue that you have undocumented people in mass numbers voting. You know,
very, very rare instances, but then just make the bill workable. But
it is absolutely vanishingly rare.
There's no evidence that non-citizens are voting.
I think they think that it's already against the law for...
We're talking about a solution to a non-existent problem. Again,
foreigners do not vote in our elections. Maybe it's partly about the SAVE Act, which is a ridiculous solution to a problem that does not exist. Foreigners do not vote in U.S. elections. That's the fact.
It's already illegal for non-citizens to vote in the United States. They face prosecution and jail time for doing it. The Save America Act attempts to solve a problem that does not exist.
So it turns out that they were wrong. And apparently all these baseless claims of non-citizens voting in our elections turned out to be true, which is interesting because, as we see time and time again, all the quote-unquote conspiracy theories tend to come out to be true when those conspiracy theories are mainstream right-wing thought. Because in my personal opinion, it's because leftists in power and just in general want you to feel minimized. They don't want you to actually spread your beliefs. So therefore they want to make you think that you're crazy for believing some of this stuff. And in fact, it's actually the truth. That's what's happening. And it's also super interesting to me too, because all this takes is just a little bit of research. There's not much research required to prove that this is happening. You could just reach that conclusion logically when you consider the fact that, like in New Jersey, a lot of people who register through the DMV are automatically registered to vote. It's not implausible to consider that in reality, when you register to vote, if you have illegals that are allowed to get a driver's license in your state, they may accidentally or intentionally actually be added to the voter rolls. And if so, then they may vote. That's just a reality of the situation, especially when we had so many illegal aliens coming into the country under Joe Biden's presidency. That's just logically speaking how that could come about. But now we actually have some of the evidence. I know we talked about it last week, all the stuff that was actually revealed during Trump's speech, and that's crazy enough. But it's just, I don't know how these people keep on pursuing the ideologies that they do when they keep on being proven wrong over and over again, but they just won't accept it. Although I do have a theory, because this week we actually had this coming from Nate Silver. He's from some people I've heard he's a leftist. Some people say he's more of a moderate. I don't know. I've seen some of his stuff. I agree with it. Some of it I disagree with. So I take it with a grain of salt. If you believe it, believe it. If not, then don't believe it. But here we have from his blog, this is the DSA Sweet Spot, highly educated, downwardly mobile. So now if you look at this graph that I have on screen right now, it's how income and education affect presidential voting. Share of two-way vote going to Democratic presidential candidate from 2016 to 2024 elections. Now, if you have a high school or less degree or a level of education and you make under 30,000, you're about 51% likely to actually vote for Democrats. And you can see this trend essentially scaling where under 30,000 continues with every single level of education that you attain. You become more left-wing and voting for Democrat Party over Republicans. It's still, the trend still exists across the board in general. However, it's most prominent among those that are below 60,000 is what it looks like, with upwards of 67 for under 30,000 and 70% for 30 to 60,000 annual salary that have gotten postgraduate degrees and vote Democrat. And this really isn't that surprising. I put up a post about this because when you think about it, people who tend to make less money and get higher degrees tend to have gotten those degrees in subjects that are not valuable in the market, whether that be history, unfortunately, because history is actually very important, but unfortunately it's not a very high-paying job because there's not much to do outside of teach other people history. And so careers like that, we also have all the woke ones that they have, like lesbian dance theory, gender and women's studies. A lot of those other degrees also have very little career paths. So typically, and this is something that applies to just about every single person, you don't want to be wrong or blame yourself for something because it's actually incredibly difficult to do. But in these instances, they seek to blame something else. And when you look at the general ideology of leftism or the modern ideology of leftism, it seeks to blame systems or entire groups of people as opposed to focusing on blaming the individual for their own problems. And this is why there's such a big problem with this, because these people, they spend a ton of money getting a degree, in some cases upwards of hundreds of thousands of dollars spending on getting these degrees. They're unable to find a job, so they're naturally upset. And this, like I said, leads them to blame other groups other than themselves. Now, not only does this lead them to blaming entire groups of people or systems for their problems, but it also leads to them believing that capitalism is not successful because they spent the money that they thought was going to give them a better education and provide them more opportunities, and in fact it gave them less opportunities, and they wasted a ton of time in the process, time and money, realistically. So it tends to push them towards socialism. So this isn't surprising whatsoever. In fact, this is something that a lot of people have actually realized. I would say for a few years now, it's just nice to actually have the data that this is what's actually happening. So if you are in that circumstance, I would highly recommend just at least consider looking at yourself and seeing what you can do to improve your situation, because once you start doing that, you'll find that it tends to be easier to make each of those little steps that you need to ultimately achieve your goals and actually get to the place in life where you want to be. And obviously, this is talking about liberalism, and one of the biggest things that a lot of liberals actually discuss and say is very important for people is psychology and therapy. Well, this week we actually had an article from the Wall Street Journal, and this is part of the American Standard segment because we want to change the culture here. And one of the biggest things is we have too many people going to therapy. I said it. A lot of people will say that's controversial. I don't think it's very controversial at all. And in fact, we realistically shouldn't be going to therapy for every single little problem that we have. But from the Wall Street Journal, are therapists to blame for the rise of adults cutting off their parents? Now, this is part one. This is going to be a bit of a lengthy segment just because I have so much data that's in this article that I feel like is important to know, and I'll give you my thoughts on it. So to start off with, proponents of the trend hold that advising patients to consider a cutoff from a close relative or spouse they deem toxic or unsupportive can protect their mental health and allow for emotional growth. Meanwhile, critics, many of whom are researchers who have studied relationships for decades, say that it encourages self-centeredness and self-delusion and ruins families. Most therapists agree that sometimes people are justified in breaking ties with their parents or a close relative, especially if they were physically or emotionally abusive. What's changing now is the bar for what is deemed abusive enough for a cutoff. We are in a culture where we emphasize fragility, everything becomes trauma, and the solution increasingly is to split and leave, says William Doherty, a therapist and professor emeritus of family social science at the University of Minnesota, who has researched the ways that therapy may be harmful, but it should be the tragic exception that you cut off a parent or loved one, not business as usual in therapy. About 25% of the U.S. population is estranged from or has cut ties with a close relative at any given time, and 10% is estranged from a parent or child, according to research by Carl Pilmer, a family sociologist and professor of human development at Cornell. He believes that more rifts are likely as tensions over politics and social issues continue to rise. Now, just starting off here, this is actually very interesting because, like any regular person with common sense could tell you, yes, cutting off your family is not a good thing. And it turns out that it's backed by the researchers. It's only the people who are actually giving the therapy to individuals that are advocating the opposite. And this logically makes sense because what does the therapy industry actually operate on? It operates on you being miserable, unhappy, stressed, anxious. They operate on all this because if they actually give you the tools to solve your life, you won't be a customer. And this is one of the problems right now that we have with the medical industry, where there's no incentive for them to actually fix your problems. They're more of an incentive for them to actually keep you in the system continually buying their drugs. So, that being said, this is not surprising in terms of the actual economics of it, but it's interesting that we have the data that this is the case. And I just want to continue because, like I said, this is a bit of a long piece. So next part is critics, however, say that therapists should be questioning their clients' estrangement beliefs, not affirming them. They warn that patients aren't always reliable narrators, especially if they have mental health issues, and the therapist is hearing only one side of the story. This can lead to two major problems, according to Jay Lebo, senior scholar and senior therapist at the Family Institute at Northwestern University, who says he often sees people in his practice who have been encouraged by previous therapists to sever ties with a loved one. You are not solving the right problem, which is the mental health crisis, he says. And this is the most tragic part. You may be encouraging them to cut off their best source of support. Critics also argue that there is no scientific evidence that separating from a close relative is inherently beneficial, and the long-term damage, including broken relationships with siblings, grandchildren, and parents as they age, is often unanticipated. You can have somebody die during the estrangement, says Christine Droney, a licensed clinical social worker in Lyritz, Pennsylvania, who often sees clients who are grieving the impact of estrangements they initiated. There are lifelong consequences. Indeed, research from Cornell's Pilmer and colleagues show that while people who start a cutoff feel a temporary sense of relief, they also experience significantly higher rates of chronic unhappiness and depression over time. He calls this the Exeter cost. Again, this is just common sense. And I know nobody has common sense anymore, and that's everybody says that regardless of where you are on the political aisle, but it's genuinely true. Nobody has common sense anymore because in the past, women would tend to talk with their friends, and that's how they would solve their problems. And men would tend to go to work. We would work out, do things. Like we would essentially work ourselves to death, which may or may not be the best solution. But there is actual studies that show that, for example, lifting weights, working out as a man does actually improve your mental health. And that's why I would personally recommend that and a healthy diet first before you go to therapy or anything like that. Then if you do decide to go to therapy, again, you should be doing it on a limited basis in my mind, especially in these instances where they're telling people to abandon their family just because they believe that may work, but in reality it doesn't. In most cases, I'll say, not in reality, but in most cases it doesn't work. And now to close out this segment, I just want to go over an example that's in this article. So this is Shoshana Rubli was a young woman living abroad when her therapist surprised her by recommending she cut off her mom. Her childhood had been chaotic after her parents divorced when she was a toddler, she says, but she didn't view it as so extreme. I went in expecting to focus on boundaries, said Rubio, who lives near Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. I thought that meant better self-discipline and better communication. Rubli tried to push back, but her therapist framed her concerns as blind spots that impeded healing, she says. So she took the advice and stopped talking to her mom. I thought it wasn't permanent, that it was just fewer phone calls when I was in my therapy process, she says. The estrangement lasted 10 years, despite her mom repeatedly trying to reach her. During that time, Rubli fell in love, got married, and lost 2 grandparents. She also experienced other family members cutting her off in anger over her estrangement with her mom. It was really hard, she said. There were all these unintended consequences. Then Rubli had children of her own and realized all parents have flaws, so one day she called her mother and the two began talking again. I was thrilled to hear from her, says her mom, Ann Tendler, 69, of Cedar Cay, Florida. It was a real trial, but I always figured that someday she would realize she had made a mistake. Rubli deeply regrets taking the therapist's advice, but says she blames herself. At the end of the day, you can't hold them accountable, she says, because you told them what you told them and you listened to what they said. And that's the most important part here. I'm not saying that therapy isn't for everybody, or I'm not saying that therapy isn't useful for some people. I'm saying that therapy is not for everybody, and I would say it's not for most people, as it currently is nowadays. I would say at least half of the people I know actually regularly go to therapy, and they seem normal. I really don't know why. I'm not going to speak to their personal matters because obviously that would be insensitive of me, but I do feel like there are better methods of doing that, especially in instances where we have people who are giving the people that they are actually giving their patients bad advice that they know is bad advice, and likely destroying families because of it, which is absolutely horrendous. So hopefully less people actually start going to therapy and more people consider the potential impacts of cutting off family members over something as silly or stupid as politics. I know that's one thing that I talk about a lot. And it's difficult for me, not because I'm fine with talking with anybody. My problem is that from my experience, a lot of times the more left-wing individuals, when you start talking politics or just getting into debates online, they tend to get nasty. And that's something that I genuinely struggle with, because I like to seek and I personally seek intellectual discussions where we're respectful to each other. And I get that it's the internet and anybody can be anonymous on there, but it's seriously, we need to get back to a place where people are kind and actually engaging in arguments in good faith, as opposed to just spewing their talking points and trying to win the debate and potentially lose somebody even further to the opposite side. So that being said, don't let politics divide your family or your friends. Just please, if you take anything away from this episode, that's the one thing I want you to take away from today. But getting back into the news, we had a news story from AP, which has obviously both sides of the political aisle a bit up in arms. And this is, in my mind, the craziest story. And this really tells you where you stand in the political aisle. So title is Sex Work or Starve. Aid workers in Nepal left jobless by USAID cuts. Turn to sex work to survive. I will say this is a bit harsh with the language, I believe. Yeah, so if you have any kids around, now would be the time to just turn off, pause, whatever, wait until they're out of the room. Okay, so now I've given you a chance to do that. Let's actually get into this. So this article starts off, this spot littered in condom wrappers and fringed by jungle is familiar to her. Ruby Lama once came here not as a sex worker, but as an aid worker who helped sex workers. For 9 years, Lama, who is transgender, had devoted her life to conducting HIV outreach in Nepal's marginalized communities, including the LGBTQ plus sex workers who wait by this highway each night. But after the United States slashed its foreign aid funding last year, Lama and more than 280,000 aid workers worldwide found themselves out of a job. Much has been written about the devastating impacts the U.S. foreign aid cuts have had on the millions of people the funding once helped. Far less is known about the impacts on the helpers themselves. In impoverished Nepal, where a conservative culture leaves openly transgender people with few legal job options, the impact on aid workers' lives was particularly crushing. Starving and scared, Lama and around 100 other LGBTQ+ aid workers left jobless by the funding cuts have turned to sex work to survive, walking the streets alongside the very people they once fought so hard to help. Now, if you haven't figured it out by now, the two possible perspectives on this story are the left wing, which is, oh my gosh, I feel so awful for these people. We really need to bring back USAID and fund them. The rational and conservative people will say, wait a second. We were giving our government money to people in Nepal, again, not the United States, not helping Americans, for LGBTQ plus HIV screening, testing. I don't even know. It doesn't even completely go through it. It's just labeled as HIV outreach. So, I mean, take that as you will. And I find it interesting that they're trying to demonize conservatives in this because they're saying in impoverished Nepal, where a conservative culture leaves openly transgender people with few legal job options. Well, I would assume that you could get some sort of job, or perhaps you could accept reality. And I know this is controversial, but a lot of times well, I'm not even going to say a lot of times, every single instance of transgenderism is a mental illness because it is in the DSM-5 as gender dysphoria. So there is a diagnosable mental illness that is there. These people tend to have multiple mental disorders, which is truly sad, and they really need help. And that's why we shouldn't be affirming them. We should be actually helping them to accept who they are as themselves and accept the body that they were given, as opposed to changing the body because that's what they feel like on a given day. So it's just kind of crazy here. And I just want to bring this up so you could kind of see the stark contrast there and say, I mean, we need more of this cuts, more of these cuts to USAID. I know it's been cut quite a bit. Please, we need to find more of this stuff and cut it because I don't want my tax dollars going over here for this. And now that was all happening in Nepal. And now going back to the States, we had some news this week in Miami. I don't know if you know who these are, but these are the Tate brothers, Andrew and Tristan Tate. These tend to be the heads of the quote unquote red pill movement. They tend to be extremely masculine. I'm just trying to use, it's difficult to use neutral language in this topic just because everybody has an opinion on them realistically. So I have this pulled up from the AP. Now, it says influencer brothers Andrew and Tristan Tate, whose social media empire promoting wealth, male dominance, and misogyny has made them among the world's most polarizing internet personalities, were arrested Saturday in Miami as British authorities sought their extradition on rape and sex trafficking charges. And that's pretty much all you need to hear about it. You can pull up the stream and check it all out. We're on YouTube and Rumble as well as Spotify now. So you could check out the video on there to see the actual source, or check in the description as I put all my sources there. So that's what happened. They were extradited to Britain over these charges. Now, I personally, I don't follow them too much. From my understanding, they properly identify a lot of the problems in modern society, where everything that is masculine is considered toxic and everything that is feminine is considered to be good, which is not true. There is some masculinity that is toxic. but there's masculinity that is not toxic, just like there is toxic femininity and there is non-toxic femininity. And we need both to actually survive in this world, as opposed to all one or all the other. And I think that's where they tend to get this wrong. I do also know that there is evidence out there that they did have a pornographic site. I don't necessarily know about the sex trafficking. Like I said, some of it is through that pornographic site, that they were allegedly sex trafficking women in that, as well as rape is alleged. So we'll see as charges come out. But this isn't the first time that this has happened. This happened to them in Romania as well. So we'll see as the trials play out what goes on. And hopefully some people will start leaving their belief system, because in reality, it's not good for really anybody to believe this stuff. Just like it's not good for women who hate men. That's not good for anybody. Men who hate women isn't good for anybody either. So let's try to bring the world back together in terms of the sexes. But now we have, this broke literally today, and the only reason I'm covering it is because this has been something I kind of wanted to talk about for a while. And not for the reason that you'd think, but let's just get into it. So today there was a verdict reached in the Shiloh Hendrix trial. So if you don't know, Shiloh Hendrix was a woman who went viral for saying the N-word on video. She was with her son, I believe, and allegedly she was saying it at a kid. I couldn't see the kid in the video I saw. It was only like a 45 second snippet, and it was allegedly a teenager who was filming it, who was Somalian. Whatever that has to do with the whole incident, I don't know. But a lot of people are framing this as it being racist and everything. But I just want to read this article, this citation quick, just so you can get the facts. So, white woman is cleared after calling black autistic boy ate the N-word, but convicted of disorderly conduct against man who filmed racist interaction. Shiloh Hendrix, 36, was filmed last April at a park in Minnesota, launching a racist tirade at an 8-year-old boy she accused of stealing applesauce from her diaper bag. She was arrested and criminally charged with disorderly conduct last August and appeared before District Judge Krista Daly in the Olmsted County Court earlier this week for a 4-day trial. Hendrix initially faced 3 counts, but one was dropped earlier this year. Hendrix was convicted by a jury last night after her conduct against the videographer, but was acquitted of her actions toward the child. She has been placed on supervised probation with 200 hours of community service and will have to pay a $1,000 fine. The jury was tasked with deciding whether Hendrix was exhibiting fighting words during the racist tirade, according to jury directions seen by the Daily Mail. Fighting words are not protected by the First Amendment, as they are likely to produce violence. The jury's verdict shows that they believed Hendrix was likely to be violent with the videographer, but not the child involved. Jury directions noted that racism alone cannot justify fighting words. Now, okay, and the reason I included that last snippet in there is just so you could actually understand what the jury was instructed to actually follow. Now, in my mind, this is only a bad decision when you consider the modern societal perspective on freedom of speech, which is that anything you say goes. And that's not necessarily the position I hold, but the way that the courts have ruled since incorporation doctrine in the, I believe it was the early 20th century when they started incorporating that to the First Amendment, and in particular to speech. This is what they were saying. They were saying that basically anything is protected speech so long as it's not a threat or likely to induce a threat. Well, a lot of the criticism of this decision is that it is a violation of the First Amendment. And to me, in the modern sense of the First Amendment, freedom of speech, that is correct, that this is a violation of the First Amendment, because she was merely speaking. Every person has the ability to say the N-word. That doesn't mean that anybody should, but they have the ability to. And that's why I see that perspective. But like I said in the intro, the conservative perspective is actually not that. And I know a lot of people will come out and say, oh, well, that doesn't make any sense. And I know Matt Walsh is actually against this ruling. In my mind, he's somewhat wrong. And the only reason for that is, like I said, you have to compare modern societal interpretations of the First Amendment to historical interpretations of the First Amendment. And if we look at the modern ones, then yes, this would be protected speech. And on top of that, this opens the door that if a white woman is being convicted of criminal charges for using the N-word, well, why aren't black people being accused the same way and charged the same way? Which realistically, that's what needs to happen here in order to actually make this make any sense. But it likely won't, to be fair. But that's kind of the modern conservatives' argument against this, is that it's a double standard that shouldn't be there. And that is completely fair. But my perspective actually goes a bit deeper, in that historical precedent is that there were actually limits on speech. Throughout the history of this country, it wasn't until incorporation doctrine that states were not allowed to impose restrictions on speech. And probably the most common instance of this were blasphemy laws that were present in most of the states throughout the history. And these laws made it so you couldn't blaspheme in public. And that's, to me, this is actually what they're doing. And I completely agree with that. I don't think that we should be allowing people to just go out and say depraved things all over the place. That's not what free speech is about. Free speech is about sharing ideas, concepts, and you don't have to necessarily say it in a naughty way to get the same point across. And that's been, in my mind, the historical tradition of this country, like I said, up until the past 100 years or so. And that's my point of contention with this, where this is actually not a bad decision in that perspective. However, like I said, this needs to be universally applied, not just to people who are white, not just to people who are black. This needs to be applied to everybody that is an American citizen, at least in this case, in the jurisdiction of Minnesota. However, it would be nice if more states started implementing blasphemy laws again. Like I said, it's been labeled as unconstitutional. However, I wouldn't be surprised if at some point in the future that was somehow overturned, but I doubt with this current court that would happen. Now, it's been a lot of heavy news tonight. Obviously, we had a lot of division between different people, whether that be based on your politics, your race in this case, your identity, I guess, in terms of the Nepal people, the USAID people in Nepal. But every week I like to close out with a moment of kindness, because the world is just such a bad place nowadays. You hear it all the time in the news, and it's nice to have some hope in the world and see nice things happening. So this week we're going to California, where we have a young boy. I don't know how old he is, which is good that they don't share his age in my mind. But he is this woman's nephew. She's a influencer, apparently. She posts a lot. She does it full time. And she was waking up in the middle of the night smelling cooking, which she thought was strange. She ended up finding out that her nephew, who was staying with her, was interested in cooking. So he would get up in the middle of the night and start cooking things. And since he started doing this, she has actually made him quite famous over it, which is quite interesting. And I think it's great to see, because how many people get this opportunity? And not only that, but for a kid like this to just go and have his own interest in making whatever food he wants. He like in this, he's talking about how he wants to make his own from scratch pizza, even his own coffee creamer on other nights. So it's cool to see this, especially because this is such a useful life skill to have. I'm a big fan of cooking. It's something I like to do in my personal time. I don't know if you guys know who Alton Brown is, but he's one of my favorite chefs of all time. I love him. He's great. But it's nice to see young people doing this. And it's not even just that. It's the fact that he's getting so much support for this and actually getting the encouragement to continue doing this and living his life this way, because that's not really happening, especially on the internet, where there's so many people are negative over literally everything. So it's just great to see this. Give him a shout out if you can. Like I said, the link is in the description. He's called Midnight Chef Amir, I believe, on Instagram only. I don't know if he's on other platforms, but I highly recommend you to go check him out, as well as his aunt. It's Morgan Ashley, because I don't know what content she puts up, but if she's putting up stuff that is actually heartwarming and encouraging her family members like this, I would recommend it to just about anybody. And that's going to do it for tonight's show. Thank you very much for listening. I don't get paid to do this, so if you could please like and subscribe and share the show around, that would be greatly appreciated. Hopefully in the coming weeks, I'm going to have an interview coming out. I just interviewed somebody for a position that is local, because politics starts at the local level. So it's really important for people to see what's going on and actually get to know their representatives. So I have that interview. Hopefully it's coming out soon. But thank you very much for listening, and I'll catch you next week on The Ben Corriveau Show.